Hey guys, today I'm going to show you how to grid a drawing so that you can accurately reproduce the exact same image on a blank area of canvas. And we're going to be using these downloaded images of primitive objects, which I've got up here, just a little collection. And you can see I have the template, which has all of them inside of it resized, and a grid superimposed on top of them. So I've selected just one of them that had some interesting shapes to demonstrate on. And what we're going to do is recreate everything in the left-hand side over in the right as a drawing, and then finish it up by painting over the top. Okay? The reason why you might do this is because if you are trying to get into serious drawing, you have to be accurate as far as what you can see. And one way to do that is to get the distances between objects, get the sizes of objects correctly estimated, and we want to do this as quickly as possible, so we need to train our eye. So really this grid is sort of a crutch to start off with, but it's a really helpful one when you're just beginning because it gives you really accurate increments to say this is 1, 2, 3.5 away from the right hand side of the document. And I can see I started in K3, so go K3 and it's 1, 2, 3.5 over from the edge of the document, so I can accurately place the tip of that cone there. So really you're just going to be playing connect the dots at first, and then when we get to something a little bit more complicated like the sphere or the what is this, a platonic solid, I don't know how many faces that is, but it's all triangles, then we can look at individual parts of the square, such as where exactly this crosses a line right here. It looks like I'm drawing on the same layer right now, so let me undo back and then make a new layer on top. So I like to set up my documents sometimes in a more complicated way than this, but we're just doing a very simple document setup because it's going to be easy. This is going to allow me with a second layer to draw and then potentially to turn down the opacity of the background so I can see my drawing more accurately later. But as you see when I do that, the transparent grid shows through. And so I like to do just one more thing, which is to add a new layer, put it underneath the original, and then just fill it with gray. So I'm just going to get bucket, fill that with gray right there, switch back to my brush, switch back to black. There we go. So now if I turn this down, it's not so annoying and I can see my drawing more clearly, or I can leave it at 100%, which is likely how you would end up working originally. For the sake of the video, since it's going to be a little easier to see, I'm going to leave it down like 60% or something like that. And we're still drawing on this upper layer, which I can turn on and off, or switch over to erase. Oh, I don't know why my eraser is so low opacity. There we go. Okay. So now I'm going to switch back to pencil, get it into a nice size. I want a nice small size of pencil so I can get some accurate markings, but it really doesn't need to be that accurate because really we're just kind of creating a guide, a sort of skeleton here. So let's start exactly as I did before. We're just going to place all the major points of these primitives, and you can draw over the original a little bit too to give yourself some like accurate measurements like that. If I want to find the angle of that line, I could see that it intersects about here and here and just draw a straight line through. That's okay too. Or this kind of thing where you draw a straight line from the side over to contacting something so you can kind of more accurately see where it is. We're not focusing initially on making a nice drawing. We're focusing initially on making good, accurate measurements. Okay? So let's start with something simple. So I see at 7 between J and K, this lines up about in the middle of this line here and then goes straight down that grid line all the way down to 9. So J and K, 7, and it starts right about here and then goes down to, I would say 3/4 of the way down to there. We'll just sketch in a line there. Then we've got this diagonal line that comes all the way down to here, not quite all the way touching line between 10 and 11, and just to the left of H and K. So here's H and K just to the left and not quite touching that bottom line. So something like that. So right about there. Then sketching in a line. I can also see this comes up vertically to here, 8 and H, So we find 8 and H, and very close, so I want to make sure that this is vertical. So I can sketch in a vertical line like that. And then right about here, I think it is. Okay. And then once more, if I draw this line, so this line should pass just above that intersection point right there. So if I draw that in, yeah, it passes just above that intersection point, just like that. Okay. Don't spend very much time cleaning up these lines. Spend time getting these lines in the right position. Okay, that's going to be the more important part. If you find that you've placed a line and somehow you are wrong, then erase it or dim it out by at least erasing partially, kind of like this, and then replace it somewhere else darker, okay, so that you can kind of see your adjustments and your mistakes. I find it's a little bit more helpful to show those adjustments than to hide them, because you may have made multiple inaccurate measurements, and it could be helpful to see how your inaccuracies are stacking up. So this thing goes away and behind back here, this actual object somewhere over here, which is good if you can see that, but if you can't, at least this will give you an accurate drawing regardless. So at this point, that line terminates into a diagonal over here where it hits this platonic solid object, and the intersection is right there. So now we're in G and 10. So we're in G and 10. So it's somewhere in here, right? And then we take a look. It's got to be higher up than that bottom corner by just a little bit. So something like this. How far to the left and the right is it? Just left of center, it looks like, right? So using these kind of methods as well, places it right about there. And here's an instance where I'm going to erase away some of those other extraneous lines and then put in my accurate line, which I believe is right there. I also like to darken in all the points I'm making, just in case the lines that I'm drawing are slightly inaccurate later on. When I go through and do my nice cleanup pass, I can see those points a little bit more clearly, and that can help. Okay. Also then we've got this some kind of diagonal line, which I'll just lightly sketch in and fill in later. So I think you get the idea there. Okay. Let's do some of the cone going up the top here in row 7 and column J. This almost hits that line, but not quite. So here's column J, here's row 7. I can see that compared to the point I've already got, the intersection is a little bit higher, very, very small amount higher. So if I make a horizontal line and just a little bit above that, it's going to be something like right there, not quite hitting that line, but very, very close to it. So I'll darken in that point, draw a line between the two. Then I could see the cone, and it's a little bit difficult. You may have to zoom in on some of these images. The cone here is actually coming that way, right? It's overlapping the edge just a little bit. So it's up to you where you measure this from. But if this was a more three-dimensional drawing, I know that this would create an ellipse, and there would be a left and a right side of the ellipse, and a top and a bottom side to the ellipse if I was drawing through it. But if you're not as familiar with three-dimensional drawing, then just try to visually find a place that makes sense to you. I'd say right about here, there's a little turnaround somewhere in that region. So this would be in column J again. So I come over and I'm going to have to zoom out to get a better view. So it's in that same grid that we've been working in. Right about here somewhere is what it looks like. And it comes up from the bottom, and then it exits just above that line there that I've already created, something like that. So I want to try to follow that line up to the peak, and I would even do this, extend those lines perfectly up to a point, and then just make note that the cone cuts off a little bit below that. So the cone cuts off about halfway through. So we're 1, 2, 3, 4th cell, 1, 2, 3, 4th cell, halfway through. My cone is going to cut off, but that's not where that point ends up. The point ends up, it looks like dead center, and about another 4th up, right about there. So then I'm going to want to rotate my canvas probably so I can get a better shot at drawing this accurately. And I'm aiming for this point that I made earlier. So something like this. nice straight line if I can manage it. Now what I'm going to do is check, do all of these intersections line up where they should on this grid? So the first one, well within the intersection, good. Second one, almost halfway down, so about here or so. Put a little dot there. This one very near to the end point. Yep, that looks about right. Next one, about halfway through. Cool. Next one, just before. Yes. And the last one, right about here, I'd say is where it crosses. So all of that looks accurate enough that I'm happy, and I'll just move on to the next one. So coming down the other side of the cone, it looks like this one just barely crosses over into column F. So it's going to be the same row down over here, column F, and it just barely passes into it. So we're going to end up right about here, it looks like. And is that where my line should start? Yeah, and it's going to cross just under the middle there. So again, I'm going to tilt my canvas so it's a little bit easier to draw. Actually, I'll zoom in a bit as well. And so then try to make a nice straight line if I can. You can see sometimes your lines curve, and that's just more practice. Take a couple practice swings at the line. I'm going to erase away a little bit and try one more time. But the reason we have the grid is to double check and make sure that we don't get any wobbling, inconsistent lines, which is very easy to do. Okay, so let's check then. So then we've got almost a symmetrical exit. So it looks like my innermost line is the correct one. About halfway, and then just a fraction, about halfway and just a fraction. Yeah, so I'm going to erase away this outbowing line because it's clearly wrong. And this inner one seems to be the correct one. So then we've got almost halfway, yes, and almost 3/4, maybe a little more than 3/4, yes. Okay, so that would be the correct line right there. Then finally for the bottom of this cone, and luckily we've got a nice shadow to indicate it, here's the bottom of that curve. This one's going to be tougher because we can't just connect a straight line anymore. This is a curving line, right? So we need this extreme middle point, which luckily from the top of the cone, we can extrapolate that this comes straight down, right, in the middle of the cone. So somewhere down there is going to be the most extreme point of this curve. And it looks like it's just maybe 1/5 into row 8 or something like that. So here we've got row 8. Here's just a little bit down. Compare it visually, okay? And then if I can, I'll flip it completely upside down because I'm right-handed. I would try to do a curve which goes no farther than that, but you can see how difficult that would be, kind of disconnected. So do your best, and again, use the grid to try to correct. Like I can see, just because I'm used to this, that this is a much flatter line than exists over here. But one of the indicators would be that I can see this crosses right through the intersection, and mine doesn't. Mine has missed the intersection. And so I want to adjust down, which means this is going to be rounder before it flattens out down there. Just one of the ways that you can double check your accuracy. Okay. So then I'm going to zoom back out again, take a look at all of that work that I've done so far, and then probably save the file and continue working. You can measure distances between objects as something to keep you accurate. You can measure, of course, the width, the total width of an object. So if I draw all the way up, right, that's the total width of the object, even though it comes to a point in the middle. You can measure the total height of an object. You can compare, well, that's not the height of the object, that's my ghosted lines, but you get the idea. Here's the height of the object. And you can compare where it lines up on other objects. So for instance, the height of this cone seems to line up right dead center on that sphere, which is a useful thing to know. Here's the dead center line of that sphere. Where might this line up? Maybe with this intersection point down here, but maybe not, okay? Lots of different ways to visually measure something, to study it, to get a sense of accuracy and proportion, which is important. The important thing here is that we're not copying verbatim necessarily, and we're trying to get all of the pieces in the right place, all the right sizes. But we're not just going through and tracing, because tracing really wouldn't teach you very much of anything, just going carefully and slowly around this thing. You end up with really ugly looking lines when you do something like that, compared to a freely drawn line that is placed more accurately. And it takes a few attempts, but you draw a freely placed line like that and it's slightly off, then you can try again, or you can make little repairs. Like I got 2 lines over here, so I could erase the less accurate one, or I could come back in closer and rotate my canvas, and then just knowing like, well, actually this line was supposed to end up there, try to make one nice curving line that goes straight through that point and hits the other important areas, right? But I'm not just going like this to try to fix it and then erase away. That ends up with a really ugly looking line. Instead, I'm trying to, again, do a natural single curve, but I'm trying to hit it more accurately within a smaller space, zoomed way in. That'd be one of the ways that I would clean up this drawing. Place in your basic accurate lines and then try to clean it up like that. And of course, this example that I just made is wildly out of place, but it was just an example of the kind of drawing that you should do once you're ready to get this all trued up and nice. Okay. So I'm going to go through doing this entire example probably in a sped up version. And then once you have your accurate drawing, we are also going to try to render all of these images, which is why all of the pictures are black and white. There is one that is not, actually there's 2 that are not black and white. So there's, sorry, that popped up on the wrong screen. There's this one, which has a canvas background. So don't pick that one unless you want something a little bit more challenging. Then some of them have grit, some of them are clearly 3-dimensional renders. I don't actually remember where I got all these. Actually, there's where I got this one. So there's credit to that person. Some stucco kind of texture on the surface when they're highly photographic. This one also has a colored background. So only pick those if you want more of a challenge. But I don't really care about the detail in the background. I only care about the objects. Also, I don't really care about the surface detailing, like the tiny pits and imperfections. I really just care about the primary shadow and light on these objects, which is the point. And so you could ignore all of that stuff if you'd like. But I would want at least the shadows that are cast on the surfaces and the contact shadows, so the darker lines underneath. But ideally, we wouldn't see any drawing at the end of this. We would only see light and dark areas of paint. So it's similar to our past assignments with just the additional step that we're doing the drawing first and the rendering second. So it's a lot of work, but I know that you guys can do it because gridding is a very straightforward process. Okay, so happy drawing. I'm going to do this in a sped up video probably in the next section. All right, you guys, I just wanted to review these last few steps before moving on to the final step here. I've come this far and got all the basic kind of tones down in the scene, all the basic shapes filled in, and the drawing is now gone. But to go back through all of those, also I just added this because I wanted to correct the shape of this sphere, which I'm going to merge with that layer before I paint any further. And I forgot to record that part, so I'm just going to turn all of those off there for a moment, except for that one. We had the rough drawing stage where I've got all of the basic lay in. I've got the clean drawing stage, which went over the top of that initially, so I've got nice sharp shapes. Then I did flat basic shapes. I also did them in these random colors just because it's much easier to see, that I could fill in all of those bits and make sure that I can lock those layers and paint freely on each one of them, not worry about bleeding into the other things. I'm going to start painting outside of those shapes and maybe trimming them down in this last stage, but I don't want to really worry about that until this last stage. And then I have basic tone filled in like you just saw, with all of the different faces taking on the different tones that are present here, but the round things looking just kind of vague. And so I'm going to try to refine all of that as I move forward from this stage. This last step is about adding the contact shadows underneath and on the sides of each of these objects, and the cast shadows as well. And you can see, like in the case of this sphere, how soft it is over here, whereas how nice and sharp it is where it encounters the sphere. And I want to try to make sure that I model that correctly. And on the ground down here, where we've got a contact shadow moving along the side of this prism, and then it gets kind of soft and vague as it moves away into the background back here. Some of this stuff could be pretty challenging to do, and some of it is pretty straightforward. Like, I think the contact shadow around the bottom of this box is pretty easy. It's just kind of a dark line, right? But as we move to the side of this prism, we've got some reflected light from this background prism down here. We've got a sharp to a soft shadow coming off of this platonic solid, and then this kind of vague kind of shape over here. So all of that could be pretty challenging, and that's without even really worrying about the grit on the surface too much. To help me out, I've got a layer here, which is just the copied original sized almost perfectly, so that I can work without reference to the grid, because I want to just kind of see the surface uninterrupted and not make it too difficult for myself. So I've got all these layers which I need to turn back on, and this basic tone layer which I want to turn off. So I'm going to start working on this and probably speed up the video again, but just know that that's what I'm doing in each one of those steps. So I'd say this is about as far as I need to go with this. There are little things that could still be fixed, I think, like the shape of the shadow on the sphere and little details here and there, like missing highlights on the prism. But going any farther than this, and it gets into a different kind of assignment. All the basics are there. Each one of these objects has the correct light and dark sides and little bits of shadow detail. You probably saw me working extensively on the ground where there's reflections visible that I can see in there, and that's all very subtle. Just whatever you can observe, shadow shapes that are sharp or soft, put them in. And especially wherever you have hard surfaces, make sure they have roughly the right tones, and then whatever kind of edge you want to put between them, either a hard or a soft one. Since all of these are real world objects, they don't have perfect, precise, sharp edges, and so I soften them all down a little bit, but really only a little bit to create the kind of realistic transition that you would get from an object that isn't going to cut you when it touches you. And I've ignored most of these pits and scratches and dents and dings because that's kind of beyond the scope of this assignment. It's going to take you much longer. If you find that you have enough time to put those things in, by all means go ahead, but it's not required at all. Just the basic tones. Okay? So happy painting, and I hope this goes well for you guys. Ask questions if you need. Bye-bye.